The next set of sessions for the rest of the day are on the different programs that comprise the Cyber Policy Center. And so the first one we're going to talk about is the Project on Democracy and the Internet, which I lead with Frank Fukuyama and Rob Reich. It's also co-sponsored by PAX here, or co-housed with PAX, the Philanthropy and Civil Society Center here at Stanford. This is going to be an evolving panel. We have people coming in, so just to make schedules work, and also to keep to my promise of no manels that I made earlier in the morning, which is that Daphne Keller from the law school, Stevie DeGroff also from the law school. They're both coming, and Matt Jenskow will be here as well. But we're going to start just. I'm going to tell you a little bit about this program. Turn it over to Frank to talk about his research interests these days, and then Rob Willer, and then depending on who comes in when, we'll turn to them. So the Program on Democracy and the Internet, which was started now 2-3 years ago, and was initially funded by the Knight Foundation, was an effort to try to bring together all the researchers here at Stanford who do work at the intersection of technology and democracy. The initial kind of seeds of this program were sown well before the 2016 election, actually, where in this room we had a conference on the future of political campaigning, which included the Republican and Democratic data folks, the FEC, and folks from the platform. That led to a series of projects on thinking about how campaigns will be changing over time due to technological changes. Then the 2016 election happens, and everyone and their mother is talking about the effect of technology on democracy. And so we have sort of generated funding for Stanford research on a range of topics dealing with issues of polarization, disinformation, political advertising, and the like. And a focus not just on domestic issues, but also international. So we run through the Project on Democracy and the Internet is run the Kofi Annan Commission on Elections and Democracy in the Digital Age. I think Steve Stedman, who's here, there he is the Secretary General of that commission, and which will issue a report sometime over the next year. The framing paper that I wrote is available outside that some of you picked up there. And so the basic question, right, that this program is trying to answer is how do digital technologies, how does the internet affect democracy, both in the United States and around the world? As I mentioned in the previous panel, my interest in this started as a guy who writes on the law of democracy and does research on things like political party, voting rights, campaign finance, and the like. But once you start getting into the question of, say, digital advertising, you quickly start realizing that all this organic content that's online is obviously a big part of the story. I also run something called Social Science One, which is an effort to try to get Facebook to open up its data to the world's social scientific community. And we actually have, right at Facebook today, a group of 50 researchers who are the first beneficiaries of access to this Facebook data, something that sort of intersects with what we here at the Cyber Center and Alex Stamos and his Internet Observatory are trying to do. I will mainly facilitate this discussion, but also will maybe present some of my own research later on. But the idea of these afternoon panels is to give you some awareness of who's doing what here at Stanford and what the goals of these different projects are. And so we have really different perspectives that will circle through this panel. We've got Frank Fukuyama, who needs no introduction, is a stalwart here at FSI, leader of the Center for Democracy and Development and Rule of Law. And Rob Willer from sociology, who also is leading a new center here at PAX on polarization that he can talk about. But one of the things you learn quickly when you try to build institutions at Stanford is that you can never talk about, like, there's an umbrella of another organization which also has umbrellas on 6 other different organizations. The way to think about this, I originally had a Venn diagram with overlapping circles. That was one way to think about it. Now I'm starting to think it's more like a galaxy, right? That we've got different solar systems that are we have so many people here at Stanford that are working on these critical questions of democracy and the internet that we're trying to, through our force of gravity, draw them in to something like the Cyber Policy Center and here the Project on Democracy and the Internet. And so you'll get a taste of that today. I saw Daphne Keller just walked in, and so she'll be up here as well. But I thought what we'll do is we'll have Frank and Rob talk a little bit about the research interests that they're working on. And then when Matt Jenskow and Stevie DeGroff come in, they'll talk about it as well. I should say that there is, as with all of the programs that are part of the Cyber Policy Center, there is a educational component as well as a research component to these things as well. Talked before about Rob Reisch's class that he's been teaching on sort of ethics and technology with Jeremy Weinstein and Meir Sahami. I also taught a class that became a public lecture series that many of you attended last term in the winter, taught with Monica Bickert, who was the head of public policy management for Facebook, on free speech, democracy, and the internet. We're going to reprise that again next winter. And as you heard, Alex is going to be teaching his class on trust and safety. So there's a lot that's going on here at Stanford in these areas, and it's only going to continue as these issues become sort of on everybody's radar screen. So I'll turn it over a little bit to Frank, who's been really thinking about these questions of media regulation, monopolies, antitrust, and the like in thinking about the new information environment.
Okay, thanks, Nate. So it's been a pleasure co-directing PDI. My main interest, and I think it's going to become an interest, a larger part of PDI as time goes on, is the antitrust question. So if you had said the word antitrust in Silicon Valley as little as a year ago, all of these eyes would have started rolling and people would have started smirking and saying, yeah, okay. But the politics of this is changing very rapidly. You've probably noticed that just in the past week, both the FTC and the Justice Department have announced that they're reorganizing in order to consider antitrust in this space. And I think this is way, way overdue. If you look at the original Sherman and Clayton antitrust acts, the motive behind it was a feeling that concentrated economic power was a threat to democracy. It was not limited to the economic threat that monopoly posed. It was also, it also took into account the problem of political concentrations of power conveyed by great wealth. This perspective basically disappeared beginning in the 1980s. Robert Bork and a number of other University of Chicago economists began to argue that antitrust should really be limited, antitrust actions should be limited to corporations that damage consumer welfare, basically as measured by consumer prices. And over time, after the AT&T and IBM and Microsoft cases, those were the last big technology antitrust cases that the US government tried to wage. There hasn't been anything in this domain, and this is largely because of the hegemony of these very, very narrow understandings of the damage that concentrated economic power can do in a democratic society. So we need to take a new look at this because as I see it, the size, and we're not talking about a lot of companies, we're basically talking about two companies here. The size of Facebook and Google poses special problems that I actually don't see how they can be solved unless they get smaller in some way. So let me just go through this. So, the economic part of antitrust, I think, has been explicated by people like Tim Wu and Lisa Kahn. It's fairly straightforward. You know, if you think about consumer welfare, Google and Facebook give away their main products for free. So how can you accuse them of charging too high prices? And obviously the cost is very different. I think the cost really has to do with lost competitiveness. I think those two companies between them have bought something in the nature of 300 startups in the last 2-3 years. And I think in many of those cases, the intention. I mean, it's very hard to prove this, but I think the intention is anti-competitive. They simply don't want other companies, smaller companies, more entrepreneurial ones, nipping at their heels, and they've got so much money that they can simply purchase them. And you've got, with Amazon raises a whole bunch of different questions where they're both a platform that hosts retailers, but they're also a retailer themselves. And so they can use the information, the metadata that they get as a host of, their competitors, and, down the road use it in an anti-competitive fashion. That's not my, that's not been my focus, but that, is obviously an issue that's going to have to be debated quite a lot, because it's obvious that the existing University of Chicago or the Chicago School interpretation of those laws is simply out of date in a digital age when information is really the main, data and information are really the main currencies. My concern is actually more with the political side, trying to think through this question of media regulation and content moderation on the internet. So there's several different questions that are raised by this. First of all, is it possible, there's a lot of effort and around the world to actually regulate the way in which the platforms themselves curate content. The Europeans are obviously out in front on this with NetzDG, where you actually criminalize fake news. That's a fairly controversial thing that I don't think is going to work in the way that they anticipate. I actually think that the main way that European or many other liberal democracies moderate content is actually through public broadcasting. I don't know, Shanto Iyengar is not here, but he's written extensively on this subject. Basically, a lot of European public broadcasters basically decide what's good for you, what kind of information you should have. They'll interrupt a soccer game to give you foreign policy news because they think it's important that you be informed. They'll play classical music instead of hip hop. They make a lot of paternalistic decisions about what kind of information is good for a democracy, because these public broadcasters are supposed to be serving a broad public interest, and there's at least in Europe, Northern Europe, a strong political consensus around that. The question is, could the US government undertake something similar to that? And there's a kind of narrower legal question about whether you can do that under the First Amendment, and then there's a broader political question about whether it's feasible. And what I'm going to argue is, and so there's lawyers on this panel, and I'm not a lawyer, so I'm on shaky ground here, so I'm sure I'll be corrected if I say something wrong. But my view is that I do think there is some degree of legal precedent for actually this kind of regulation, but I think it is politically impossible. And given that it's politically impossible, as far as I can see, the only solution is then to make these platforms smaller and more competitive, or to make that entire space more competitive. So let's just go through this. There is precedent for government regulation of large oligopolistic media companies. The Radio Act of 1927 and the Communications Act of 1934, the latter established the FCC. Both say that public interest is one of the objectives of the regulation. It's not simply the commercial benefit of the companies involved. And the FCC's powers in that respect have evolved over time based on this statutory claim of public interest. There was, I think the best way to illustrate it is by looking at the rise and the fall of the Fairness Doctrine. There was an amendment in 1959 to Section 315 of the Communications Act, which gave the FCC statutory power, in effect, I think, to act like a European public broadcaster, that they could enforce standards of political fairness so that you got fair and balanced media coverage of political events. This was contested. One of the Supreme Court, this got to the Supreme Court in the 1969 Red Lion versus FCC case. It has a lot of overtones of our current controversies because the media company in question was a right-wing Christian broadcaster that was, promoting conspiracy theories about, communist conspiracies and this sort of thing. And the question was whether the FCC could pull their license. It went to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court basically said that it was legal for them to, or it was constitutional for them to do this on the basis of the fact that the networks, the radio and TV networks at that time were oligopolies. And that it was that concentrated power that gave them this extraordinary ability to shape, the public space, and therefore they were constitutionally enabled to do this. This resulted in something called the Fairness Doctrine, which the FCC then tried to implement. This was extremely controversial. Basically, I think the Democrats liked the Fairness Doctrine because they didn't like these right-wing broadcasters, and Republicans and conservatives tried to do away with it. They tried to do away with it on numerous occasions. They lobbied the FCC. Eventually, it was rescinded by the FCC in an administrative ruling, not in a statute. The Democrats kept trying to bring it back on several occasions, and eventually it simply died. The efforts to bring back the Fairness Doctrine by statute were basically vetoed, once by Ronald Reagan and once by President Bush, and that's where it stands. So the precedent is a little bit complicated. The Supreme Court never ruled on that issue per se, but it was clearly something that the political system could not resolve because there basically was an agreement on fairness, on what constitutes fairness. Now, the current situation with regard to internet regulation, I think actually can use this as a bit of a precedent, right? So the First Amendment actually protects the ability of the big platforms to curate content, right? They are private. I mean, the First Amendment only applies to the government. They're not the government. And so they can actually take down child pornography, abusive material. They've been doing this, in relatively non-controversial areas up till now. They're now being asked to make, in effect, very complex political decisions, which we talked about in the earlier panels, like, the Nancy Pelosi video. Is that political content? If so, is it acceptable? Should it be left up? And so forth. I think that, and I guess a further issue has to do with Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, which it's interesting, it's widely misinterpreted as an act that prohibits the FCC from curating content. I think actually the intent was the opposite. You'll tell me if this is incorrect, but the intent was actually the opposite, that the First Amendment is what protects their right to curate content, and Section 230 was actually designed to prevent litigation that would effectively force the platforms to avoid curation for fear of litigation, all right? So it could happen, and I actually think that given the history of the Fairness Doctrine, you probably have no alternative but to have these platforms make these very complex decisions as to what is free and fair, what is unacceptable, in terms of protecting democratic values in speech on the internet. This would be fine. I mean, there are a lot of things called media companies like the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal and so forth that make these kinds of decisions all the time. So it's not unprecedented that a private corporation should curate content without, tremendous government oversight. The problem is that these platforms are just too damn big, right? Unlike the New York Times, if you want to communicate with people today and you don't want to use Facebook or one of Facebook's, purchase companies, it's pretty hard to do that. And I think that makes these companies very much like the broadcast networks of the 1950s and 60s. They are in this oligopoly or virtually monopoly position, and that's not just in the United States, it's in other countries as well. So they are, in effect, acting like governments. And so, Facebook is now creating a Supreme Court. It's having actually a discussion with somebody at Facebook about this. It's sort of like the East India Company which ruled India, and so they developed a court system, they developed an army, and then at the time of the Indian revolt, they actually started killing people because they were, a de facto government, even though they were a private company. And I think that, these platforms are putting themselves in that kind of position. And since I don't really see a way for the government to regulate speech, and it's not that you couldn't do it, right? The Germans do it through ZDF, the British do it through BBC. I mean, democracies have ways of doing this, but in our current polarized, highly polarized political environment, having any sort of agreement on what is free and fair is really going to be hard. The majority of the takedowns that have been done by the platforms, have not been evenly divided between left and right. There is a certain bias, and I actually think that there's a certain, I don't like Alex Jones, but there's a certain uneasiness, I have when a private company decides that Alex Jones is unacceptable, for our democracy, but, other types of speakers are not. And so that's why I think antitrust is inevitable, because the only way to solve this is to make them smaller. Thank you.
I think I was originally going to go to Rob, but I think I'm going to go to Daphne because in thinking about CDA and about regulation, Daphne is, she's going to shake her head, but literally the world expert, I think, on intermediary liability, runs the intermediary liability project here at the Center for Internet and Society in the law school, and is a sort of treasure trove of knowledge on regulations around the world as they apply to internet companies. So I thought it might be a good segue from what Frank was saying about CDA and other things to what you're thinking about.
Thank you, Nate. So I'm going to disappoint you both by being late, for
No,
which
no.
I apologize.
It's quite all right.
And by not really talking about intermediary
Oh,
liability.
okay. You want to talk about fake news in Russia today? We've had, a lot on that too. So, yeah.
So Nate told me that I could talk about anything I wanted. And so I got to thinking, and I actually want to say something somewhat untested. So for once, I'm going to read off a piece of paper, which those of you who know me know I don't do that much. But I would put it to you that in this area writ large, we are thinking too small. And we're also thinking too big. Too much of our mental energy and our research budgets and the way we frame the questions are at one zoom level of the microscope, and we're not looking at the much more zoomed in level and the much more zoomed out level as much as we should be. So here's how I think we're thinking too small. I think for all of the hullabaloo, we're underestimating just what a big change we're going through because of the change in internet communications. There has never in human history been anything like the internet. So much, despite the fact that precedent like broadcast is incredibly useful, we figure out the things that are analogous and use them, still, this is profoundly different. So much of ordinary human behavior is now mediated through machines that can track it and police it and maybe shape it with nudges, stronger or weaker nudges. And those machines are run by private companies that don't have the duties that governments might. So most famously, that includes the communications that shape our beliefs about what's true and who we should vote for. And this is something where Nate is perhaps the world's leading expert. But it also includes really quotidian stuff. Things that would have been ephemeral, maybe intimate communications up until just a few years ago. Something that would have been a note passed in class, or a whisper to a friend, or an off-color remark made in a bar that might or might not have gotten you beaten up, but now sort of disseminates through the internet and finds other people who like it. That's really different. The things that are mediated through the internet also include our private thoughts. Something that might have been in a diary before might be in a Google Doc now. And it's also behaviors, things we don't even think of as speech. If you go looking for prenatal pills online and haven't told anybody you're pregnant yet, you are sharing information that's very consequential, and how that information gets used is very consequential. Now, all of this is knowable, and all of this is policeable, and the entities with power to do it, because they're private companies, they're not subject to the First Amendment. They're not subject to the Fourth Amendment in terms of, the protections that they give to our information. And we kind of don't know what to do with that. We're very much struggling to figure out, now that there's this non-government source of power that can do these things we've never seen before, what are the rules supposed to be? I think that to figure that out, we need some very big picture thinking about power, and about what we expect from private companies and what we expect from the government. I have a piece on this called Who Do You Sue that Nate helped make possible. And what I try to point out there is that right now the lack of clarity on this is creating a really big mess, and it's a mess that hits individual rights the hardest. Private companies are operating the equivalent of the public square, not to mention of the post office and the currency system, but they're not subject to the kinds of rules we're used to for those services or those places. And for lots of good reasons, by the way. I'm not saying that Facebook should have to tolerate every kind of speech that is tolerated under the First Amendment in the public square. That's some really ugly speech. Meanwhile, governments are essentially strong-arming platforms to take down lawfully protected speech by saying, hey, put this in your terms of service and take it down voluntarily. Otherwise, we're going to pass a law and you're not going to like it. And so there's state power being used for consequences that would be prohibited by the Constitution or by international human rights law if it were done through ordinary democratic processes and without sort of laundering that power through private platforms. Every part of that dynamic leaves speech rights out in the cold in favor of other interests. In many cases, it leaves privacy rights out in the cold. It may leave equality rights out in the cold. For example, if patterns of taking down too much speech specifically affect people who are speaking Arabic or talking about Islam, as a lot of people think is going on, we don't have a legal framework to respond to that. And I've spent a lot of time thinking about what one would be, and it's really, really hard, as it turns out. And that's before you add what I think is a near universal consensus that there's some speech that the First Amendment protects, but that people want platforms to take down. And the Christchurch shooters video is, a very compelling example there. In many instances, sharing that is something the government cannot stop you from doing. But everybody, as far as I can tell, wants Facebook not to share it. One reason that this big picture thinking gets hard, and something where I think the Cyber Policy Center can make a real contribution, is where there are intersections between previously separate realms of law or academic inquiry or just expertise. So for example, speech law and privacy law, those run into each other a lot as we think about platform power and how to respond to online threats. Privacy law and competition law, all three. Privacy law and speech law and competition law and election law, and public health law. Nobody actually has, much as law professors or lawyers like to pretend we know all that stuff, nobody knows all that stuff. And so it's very hard to respond appropriately where suddenly questions are overlapping that didn't overlap before. So here's an illustration of that overlap issue on the theme of, are private platforms the public square? Can you sue them to make them reinstate your speech? This is something that about 30 people have tried doing in the US. They've all lost. The platforms so far, the rule is they can take down whatever they want. But guess what? There's a case on this before the Supreme Court. And no internet lawyers are paying attention to it, or close to no internet lawyers, because we all think, oh, that's a telecom case. That's not our field. But it's a case about public access channels on cable TV and whether speakers have a First Amendment right to compel a private company to carry their speech on the public access channel. Sound familiar, right? That's very much what we're asking in these platform speech cases. But because communications lawyers are kind of in one silo and internet lawyers are generally in another, there's just not that much overlap, and we miss opportunities both to make our analysis much better, to figure out what has happened before that's analogous and build on it, and we lose opportunities for advocacy. You know, there are some groups that weighed in with amicus briefs in this case, but most organizations that pay attention to the internet issues weren't paying attention to the telecom issues. Here's another intersection point. There are very senior, very experienced competition lawyers who will say things like, user data is the new oil, and Facebook should have to share it with competitors in order to enable competition, which, you know, sounds pretty good. At the same time, very experienced, very senior privacy lawyers say things like, the Cambridge Analytica scandal shows why we need major barriers to Facebook ever sharing user data with another company. How do you reconcile those two things? We will talk past each other unless we think bigger, you know, unless we pull back the zoom and have both of those areas of expertise in the room. And by the way, somebody who's written well on, I put this note in the wrong place, but someone who's written well on the cable and must platforms carry speech and can we look to broadcast regulation is a guy named Harold Feld at Public Knowledge, who put out a Creative Commons licensed book on this just a week or two ago, and it's very interesting. Okay, so here's where I think we need to think smaller, and you know, I could talk for 5 hours about where we need to think smaller, so I'll only give a couple of examples. Only operationalizable things happen. If you want platforms to do something different, it has to be something that's possible to put into practice. It has to be possible to build a tool or to train moderators or, you know, to use the things that are available to reach your desired outcome. And if you're not proposing something and running it through that filter of like, well, is this possible? How would you do it? Then you're not being helpful. Similarly, if you have a plan for the law, but you haven't looked at, say, what the First Amendment precedent says from things like the broadcast cases, then that's not very helpful. If you have a theory of why CDA 230 needs to change, but it's based on this misunderstanding that Frank referred to, thinking that it requires platforms to be neutral, when in fact Congress was trying to get platforms to go out and moderate user content, well, that's a problem. You need to zoom in a little more and understand the underlying details. On must-carry claims, what I call must-carry claims, this idea that you can sue a platform and make them reinstate your speech because of your First Amendment rights. What would it mean if plaintiffs won those cases? Would it mean that Facebook has to admit every single thing that's legal up to and including the Christchurch video? Or would it mean something else? And if it means something else, what is that? And who defines that rule and how is it enforced? Does it mean that Twitter has to just reinstate your tweet? Or does it mean that it has to make sure its ranking algorithm doesn't hide your tweet down 50 scrolls lower? You need an answer to that before you can have a realistic proposal for some kind of carriage obligations for platforms. Does it matter if users have their own controls over what content they want to see, and the vast majority of them say, I don't want to see hate speech even if it's legal. I don't want to see violence even if it's legal. And so de facto, all this stuff gets blocked anyway. You know, does that matter? Do we stop people from doing that? Final example of a place where zooming in more would have been really important, and I'm kind of on a tear about this week, is there's a case going to Europe's highest court between Facebook and Austria. An Austrian court said that a user committed defamation by saying that a politician was a treacherous oaf and a fascist. This would not be defamation in many countries, including some other countries in Europe, but it was defamation in Austria. Then the court said, Facebook has to take that down globally so no one in the world can see it, and they have to build a filter to block out those words so no one can ever say them again. That's the Austrian court's ruling. This week, a preliminary opinion from Europe's highest court, not the final opinion, but something that is very influential on them from a guy called the Advocate General. It said, yep, that's fine. Austria should be able to order Facebook to build this filter, and it shouldn't always be able to order global takedowns, but sometimes it should be able to. And what's really striking about this opinion is how it fails to zoom in on kind of any kind of facts, right? Like, it doesn't zoom in on what the research on filters shows they can actually do. Which, by the way, doesn't include doing this task very well. If you look at a Wikipedia entry for something called the Scunthorpe problem, and don't mind seeing some dirty words, there are a lot of examples of how text filters fail. People who have been the victims of racial slurs and want to talk about their experience by describing what was said to them, a text filter is going to block them from talking too. So there are, down in the weeds, there are these problems with a recommendation, but if you're at the wrong Zoom level and you're like, that's great, yes, definitely Facebook should stop that from happening, you are going to make a reach a legal conclusion that is, I think, very poorly considered. All right, so I will stop because I think I've run through my time, sorry. But I do think that the people you have assembled here have an ability to do that zoomed very in perspective and that zoomed very out perspective, and so I expect great work and I'm very excited.
Thank you. I want to just add one thing in part of my celebration of Daphne, which is that as you can see, one thing we hope to make a difference in here in the Cyber Policy Center by having people like Daphne and Alex Stamos is to leverage, obviously, our position here in Silicon Valley, right? So that it's not just that we're trying to bring people from across campus who do different things in electrical engineering, computer science, law, political science, but also to take advantage of those who've parachuted out of the technology firms at some point in the last few years to really give us what's happening on the ground. Many of them, and you heard this also in what Daphne's saying, is sort of provide this on the ground experience that a lot of us who are spending time in, I was going to say in books, but I guess we don't spend time in books that much these days, but doing research outside of the firms really don't have the perspective. So Daphne offers that. Let me turn to Rob Willer and then to Matt. Yeah.
Great. I'm Rob Willer. I'm a professor of sociology and psychology here at Stanford and the director of the Polarization and Social Change Lab. Our lab has a focus on three kind of complementary polarization problems, all of which intersect with the central mission of PDI, all of which intersect with internet communication and behavior. So one of the areas that we study is building political consensus. So this research is focused on political messaging, persuasion, framing. Another area of our research concerns the deleterious effects of polarization. So this work concerns political animosity across party and ideological lines, as well as biased processing and handling of political information. And then a third area of our work concerns social activism and affecting social change, positive social change. So what are techniques of social change agents that are more or less effective? And, we have done some collaborative research with PDI, and I want to talk about a couple of those projects briefly here. These are both projects that are currently in progress still, so I can't give you the final word on our empirical research, but I can tell you something of what we've learned and what we're studying. And I should acknowledge both these projects are collaborative with David Rand, my colleague at MIT. So we're deeply interested, talking about micro versus macro lenses on like unwanted political behavior online or deleterious aspects of polarization online. This would be sort of the in the weeds micro level dynamics that drive some unwanted aspects of polarization online. we're very interested in the biased handling of evidence online, both people's tendency to believe and assign credibility to political information that they probably shouldn't, and also their tendency to then send on that information to their peers on social media platforms. And we have projects on both of these. So first of all, on biased handling or biased processing of politically relevant information, we're working now on a project where we're trying to develop an intervention that would intervene to sort of essentially train people to be less biased in their handling and assignment of credibility to political information they confront online. And we identify 3 major mechanisms that, at least in our theoretical model, drive the biased handling of political information. So one of these is our partisan and ideological motivations, so that you identify strongly as a Republican or a Democrat or a progressive or a libertarian, and then disidentify with whatever are the apparent rival political groups, plays a large role in driving people's sort of ideologically biased political reasoning. You want to come to the conclusion that this piece of information is valid, and that that motivation, affects your reasoning. Likewise, you want to assign low credibility to this information that would favor the other side, and so you assign low credibility to that information independent of its actual objective credibility. And research on biased political reasoning shows that essentially everybody does it. There were these kind of early takes that there were certain ideological persuasions that exhibited political bias more than others, and I would say the sort of state of the art now is that ideology is biasing, as you might guess. So first of all, partisan and ideological motivations. Second, and we often overlook this, is accuracy motivations. Another reason that you might handle information in an ideologically biased way is you're insufficiently motivated to handle it in a sort of accurate, evidence-based way. So this is another factor. And this is important to remember because there is this sort of, I think, lay intuition that if we're going to reduce biased political reasoning, that we have to just reduce people's partisan or ideological motivations, just make everybody a centrist. But strictly speaking, it's really the ratio of your political motivation to your accuracy motivation that produces biased political reasoning. And you could conceivably leave someone very politically motivated, but somehow promote their accuracy motivation to be greater than their political motivation and reduce biased information handling in that way. And then a third mechanism that I think drives, that in our model anyway, drives biased handling of evidence online is just sort of a lack of awareness of cognitive bias, an inability to do pattern recognition of like, this is what biased reasoning looks like in the cut of everyday life and in the cut of online interactions and information processing. So for example, if you had a robust understanding that when you assign credibility to information that you would like to believe is true, that those kinds of conclusions tend to be biased, and that you would come to a less biased conclusion if you revisited that conclusion and gave it second thought and reconsidered it skeptically, knowing that you are sort of dispositionally disposed to that bias, then that could lead you to more accurate reasoning. So the sort of we lack, or at least the general population lacks a sort of suite of metacognitive skills for recognizing bias when it's happening in others and in oneself. So this model in turn suggests the sort of levers that you could press if you were going to try to develop a platform to reduce people's political bias in their handling of evidence online. And so this is what we're trying to do now. We're running behavioral experiments to test whether interventions to reduce partisan and ideological motivations can reduce biased information handling, whether there's ways to increase accuracy motivations, and then third, increasing metacognitive awareness of what bias even looks like when you're doing it or when other people are doing it, whether these interventions can lead people to handle evidence in a more even-handed, fair-minded way in the course of interacting online. And my own sort of master theory of this is that pressing multiple of these levers, or really all 3 levers at once, will be what's most effective. Again, this is in part because it's really the distance between your sort of partisan and ideological motivations vis-a-vis your accuracy motivations that drives the motivational aspect. So pressing both those levers at once could be most effective for reducing people's biased political reasoning. And then likewise, you could mitigate people's bias, but if they have like essentially wired in heuristics to deploy bias in the course of their everyday perception, they're going to keep doing it because it's just the way they've always thought and processed information. It's a heavily reinforced, shortcut-based way of engaging with the world. And so you've got to give people also the ability to detect bias as it unfolds. So if you could somehow do all three of those at once, in a nifty 2-hour training program, then maybe you could have some sort of durable effect on people's biased handling of evidence, or at least that's the idea. A second reason why pressing multiple levers at once could be good is just population heterogeneity. There's some people where you're going to be ineffective at increasing their accuracy motivations. They lack the raw material to work with. They're not particularly motivated to be really accurate in their cognition, and so pressing on the other two levers could still make a difference for them. So this is our first project that we're working on, and we're very excited about it. But of course, when we think about the problem of biased information handling and sharing online, it's not just a psychological problem, it's also a social problem, right? Like you could negate people's, or you could mitigate people's tendency to assign undue credibility to information that fits their partisan and ideological preconceptions, and you might still have a bunch of really biased information going around online because of purely social motivations. And here, so we're working on a project on this as well, and we're very interested in the role that information sharing in online contexts plays in signaling shared group affiliation. So I might share partisan media, maybe even partisan media that I suspect is not entirely accurate because it serves a shared group identity signaling function. I say I'm a Democrat and you're a Democrat and you're in my online social network, and I share this piece of journalism that makes our side look good and makes the other side look bad. This could be effective for getting you to understand that we're in the same political and moral community. We can trust one another, and we're all good people here, right? And that social motivation is its own thing and has its own dynamics. And so part of the problem of the circulation of highly partisan and ideological news online, it's not just a problem of assigning greater credibility to this sort of information than it deserves, but also our social motivations to signal to one another our shared group affiliation. So I don't want to go on too long, but we're working on some experiments now to try to understand the sort of group signaling function of news sharing online. And one of the things that I think is very interesting is this seems maybe like a little bit more of a theoretical kind of basic science sort of project than the first one that I talked about, which is kind of explicitly applied, trying to actually like train people to have some sort of durably reduced political bias in their information handling. This one seems maybe a little bit more abstract, but I think I think that it will have important applied implications. So, for example, you might have the intuition going into a project like this that I did, that if we could reduce the salience of people's political identities in online interactions, that would sort of reduce echo chamber effects, reduce ideological news sharing, reduce ideological information handling online. We just need to like turn down how political people's signifiers are online, and it might make things better. And then you might also have thought that it kind of made sense, this group signaling function of information sharing online. But those two are sort of opposed, right? Because if you turn down credible signals of people's political identities online, it actually could have the inadvertent effect of increasing their motivation to signal their political identity to one another, to make through their news sharing and through their information commenting online, because they now don't have the very credible signal on their profile where it says I'm a Democrat or I'm a libertarian. And so I need to signal that. The only way I can signal that, if I'm motivated to do so, is through my commenting and through my news sharing. So we need to understand these microdynamics in order to intervene effectively to reduce these biases online. And so that's why we're starting from the bottom up. And we believe a robust understanding of the psychological and social dynamics that drive biased information handling and processing and dissemination is important for either bottom-up interventions or top-down structural interventions to reduce these dynamics.
Great. Matt Jenskow.
Thanks so much. So I'm Matt Jenskow. I'm a professor in the economics department. I also apologize for the fact that I couldn't be here right at the beginning to hear the beginning of Frank's remarks. And this is all fascinating. In some ways, I'd love to just leave the time to talk more about what everybody has said already. I thought I'd just mention quickly some of the recent research we've been doing, which has been very much supported and tied into PDI and the work that's being done here and all of the support for it. I guess my research broadly is about the economics of media in a lot of different facets, and that includes both some of these questions around regulation and antitrust in media markets, but also political impacts of media. And so the study I thought I'd mention just briefly is a project we did recently trying to use an experimental design to get at the causal impacts on Facebook on some of the outcomes that have been the focus of a lot of recent discussion. And I think as backdrop for that, for us, it's really important to remember that not that long ago, even though it seems like kind of hard to remember, most of the conversation around social media and the impact that social media was having on society was about all of the good things that it was doing for society and all of the ways in which this is facilitating connections and communications among people and making it easier for people to organize around causes that they care about, and people in autocracies to be able to organize protests and so on. That conversation has obviously shifted to a lot of focus on the potential negative consequences and of social media in particular. And I think for the purposes of the way we thought about trying to build this study, it's useful to group those into two pieces, two groups of concerns that have been out there. One is, in a sense, ways in which these tools and social media use might be harming the individual users themselves. So that is something like addiction leads me to use Facebook more than is good for my own personal happiness, or these tools are leading people to, through a variety of behavioral forces, to be less happy or more depressed or more lonely or increasing suicide rates. Big conversation around those things, all of which you can think of as, like, I as an individual user, I'm not really acting in my own best interest when I choose how much time to spend or what kind of things to do on these platforms. And then the other side, which is the more relevant one for the conversation today, is the way that the decisions I make as an individual spill over and affect society more broadly, particularly via my role as a citizen and a voter in democracy. And so all of these debates around discussion around the kind of information that people are getting, true information, false information, polarization, and so on. So the idea with this project was pretty simple. It was like, could we design an experiment to get at some direct measurement of, or at least get a little bit closer to some direct measurement of those effects? So we did this experiment where we, last year, had a big sample of people, some of whom were randomized into a group where we paid them to deactivate their Facebook accounts for a month in the run-up to the 2018 midterm elections. And with more time, I'd tell you all about how do we do that, and how do we make sure that they deactivate their accounts, and how do we choose what price to pay them, and there's lots of details that are helpful to understand this. But for now, just envision we have a couple thousand people, some of whom are going to take a month-long break from Facebook in October to November of 2018. And then we're going to, once you've paid the big cost of setting something like that up, we want to try to measure as many outcomes as we can. So we're going to have a suite of outcomes that are about these individual effects, including things like measures of subjective well-being and happiness, whether this time off of Facebook leads people after the experiment is over to use Facebook more or less than they did before. Did you maybe learn something from this about how much you like being off of it, or is there some kind of addictive? Think about like people going to detox. Typically we think if something's addictive and you send them to detox for a month, they then do whatever that thing was less once it's over. So we can measure those things. On the side of this relevant to democracy, we can measure, first of all, how this affects people's time use and where they're getting information, measures of how informed they are about real facts in the world, as well as potentially what they think about false stories that are circulated on Facebook, political participation and engagement, and then also some measures of polarization. That's kind of the outline of what we tried to do. I don't have time, obviously, to talk through all of the results of that, but let me just give you a quick summary of what we see on this side relevant to democracy. So the first thing that's relevant to that is just how do people substitute their time? So the average person in this study prior to being in the experiment is using Facebook for about 60 minutes per day on average. So we took Facebook away, now you have 60 minutes each day to do something with. What do people do with those 60 minutes? The answer to what they do is really important for what we think might be the effects of that. For example, when people talk about how is social media changing the kind of diet of information that people have, it really matters whether in the absence of Facebook, they would be then turning to some alternative news sources that might be higher quality or getting no information at all. I think a lot of me and colleagues and academics and journalists and people who discuss this sometimes have in the back of their mind, like, obviously if people were on Facebook, they'd all be reading the Wall Street Journal every day, or reading the New York Times every day, or whatever is my favorite source. So if that's right, that would have very different implications than if that's wrong. So the first thing we see is, do people, when they're off of Facebook, substitute either to other social media or to other digital news or to other news? And the answer to all of those things is no. Not only do they not substitute toward other digital things, but they actually use all other digital things, including other social media, less when they're off of Facebook. So, and I think one simple way to understand that is just, if you're not on Facebook, you're not picking up your phone all the time. And that picking up your phone, getting all these notifications, leads you to use the digital things a lot more. So people get back more than 60 minutes to do offline things. They don't spend any of that time, as far as we can tell, consuming news, but they spend it doing everything else, watching television, spending time with their friends, spending time with their family, and so on. So you can think about what that might imply about, are people going to be more or less informed about real facts when they're off of Facebook? If they're not switching to other news sources, well then, were they getting any real information from Facebook? And the answer is, people are less informed during the month that they're off of Facebook about real news events. So if you ask them quiz questions about factual information in the news, people who are using Facebook answer those questions better than people who aren't. So Facebook is, in that sense, actually informing people about real facts. At the same time, consistent, I think, with many people's intuition, we can also confirm by a number of different measures that people who are on Facebook are also more polarized in their views. You see more polarization in views on issues. You see effects in the direction of more effective polarization, like people feel more negative toward the people on the other side. So there's sort of a double-edged sword. Social media is making people more informed, but it's also making them more polarized. That, once you think about it, is not a super surprising combination of results, because there's lots of evidence from many places that as people become more informed and engaged about politics, they also become more polarized and extreme, in a sense, in their views. Basically, think about it, there's a kind of trade-off there that doesn't have an easy answer. Would we rather have a democracy in which nobody really knows what's going on, but they're also not mad at each other? They kind of like each other and they're all happy. Or would you rather have a democracy where people are informed and engaged, but also more polarized as a result because they have strong views because they know about these things and care about them? So I think these results kind of highlight that trade-off. And I think in some sense, they confirm the worst of what we might think, in that they certainly provide some evidence for this hypothesis about polarization. But they're also an important reminder that, I think this is something that's often missed, and this is the last thing I'll say. If you think about news consumption in the United States, the overwhelmingly important fact is just how little of it there is. How few people, we talk all the time about cable news and Fox News and MSNBC. The share of Americans who watch any significant amount of cable news in a month is extremely small. It's like maybe 20% or something. It's like quite small. So most of the time, people are not getting much news at all. And one thing that Facebook does, for better or for worse, is take a whole bunch of people, particularly in the kind of demographic groups where people tend not to get news, and expose them to some of it, and expose them to political content and political information. And that's neither obviously good nor bad, but it's a piece of this trade-off that we often, I think, don't talk enough about. So I'll stop there.
Thank you very much. This has been, the menagerie of folks that we have here in the project of Democracy in the Internet. We have used all of our time, but come and ask us questions in the breaks. I think now I'm not sure who's up next. Do we have?
Yeah, the program on geopolitics, technology, and governance is up next.
Andy Grotto and his team will come up next. Thank you all, and stay tuned.